I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute to this symposium on Toward a Moral Economy, Globalization and Developing World. My name is Jean-Luc Marion. I am professor at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Russell Engineer, professor at the University of Tulsa and co-chair of the Lumen Christi Institute program in Catholic Social Thought, will moderate the debate and introduce the panelists. I just would like to thank the John Neff Committee on Social Thought and the Tseng Foundation Endowment for Market-Based Program and Catholic Value, Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts, College of Arts and Letters, University of Notre Dame, for sponsoring this very important lecture. It is very appropriate that the Committee on Social Thought should co-sponsor to this lecture, since its founder, John Neff, was an economist with a deep interest in Catholic thought, and which remain present in the destiny of the Committee on Social Thought. But at last, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the University of Chicago His Eminence Peter Kovdo Appiah Cardinal Turkson. Cardinal Turkson hails from Ghana, West Africa. From 1992 to 2009, he serves as Archbishop of Cape Coast, Ghana. And he was president of the Ghana Catholic Bishops' Conference from 1997 to 2005. He was made a cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 2003 and was a cardinal elector in the recent conclave that elected Pope Francis in March. Much like the new Pope, he has been an outspoken voice of concern for the poor and the need for us to confront poverty effectively, both at a personal level in our direct interaction with others, and also through our economic institutions and practice, whether local, national, or transnational. Since 2009, Cardinal Turkson has been president of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, whose mission is not only to promote the cause of justice and peace throughout the world in the light of the gospel and the social doctrine of the Church, but also, I quote, to assemble and evaluate the result of research on justice and peace, the development of peoples, and the violation of human rights, end of quote. And so, as a community of scholars and researchers here at the University of Chicago, we are honored to have His Eminence Cardinal Turkson visit our campus to engage as a well-known free thought and free, bold speech voice in the Church, to engage on the topic of globalization and economical development. Join me to welcome Cardinal Turkson.
Thank you, Professor, for your kind words of introduction and for welcoming me to the University of Chicago. Your Eminence, Cardinal George, Your Excellencies, Bishop Vigano, the Apostolic Nuncio, my Lord Bishops, Reverend Fathers, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I greet all of you very warmly in the name and on behalf of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in the Vatican. And on its behalf, I wish this symposium, as it has been presented, great success. 50 years ago, last month, good Pope John the 23rd signed and promulgated his landmark encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. This was 11th of April, 1963. The beginning of next month marks 50 years since John the 23rd died. In February this year, Pope Benedict's courageous retirement opened the way for the election of Pope Francis, who reminds many of Pope John, the good for being of the being of people, and bold for throwing open again, as it were, the windows of the church. A week ago, the Holy Father explained, the Pope has the duty in Christ's name to remind the rich to help the poor, to respect them, to promote them, and he went on to appeal for disinterested solidarity, for a return to a person-centered ethics in the world of finance and in the world of economics. This would be my duty too this evening or this afternoon in addressing globalization and the developing world. I shall try then to introduce some key ideas of the Catholic social teaching. After bringing in general points about globalization, I shall then weigh some of its effects in the developing world. We can then look at the Church's social teaching again for guidance in humanizing globalization or making globalization fair. Our conclusion then would ask how one might would together legitimate the goals of all customers, and that is our entire human community that receives, and that makes the experience of globalization. So let us begin. What is the Church's social teaching, which is our point of departure? Let me begin with a short answer in the local idiom. And it is this, that the University of Chicago was founded in 1890. Modern Catholic social teaching began in 1891. The motto of this university is Crescat Scientia Vita Scholatur, which means that let knowledge grow from more to more, and so human life may be enriched. The parallels with the Catholic social teaching could not be more apt. Beginning with the first social encyclical Rerum Novarum of Pope Leo XIII, which came out in 1891, the Catholic social teaching is being known then as a knowledge based both on faith and on reason, in friendly dialogue with other branches of knowledge. Some will prefer to refer to it as reading the signs of the times from the point of view of the Christian faith. It is a moral discourse about man and the world, to use the happy phrase of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And over the same nearly 125 years, the Church's social teaching has grown more and more in order to protect, to enhance, and to promote human life. So while modern Catholic social teaching was born just a year after the University of Chicago, its origin goes way back, even to the time of Abraham. The mission of Abraham, as you may know, and his offspring, according to the book of Genesis chapter 18, was to cultivate justice and righteousness. Israel's vocation, or the vocation of the sons of Abraham in the Old Testament, was to justice, contrasted with the condemnation of Sodom and Gomorrah for the lack of justice. In this biblical context, then, what does the church mean by justice? It simply means fidelity to the demands of the relationships in which we stand, especially the threefold relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with the land. Later, the word of God called Moses to deliver Israel from Egyptian bondage. Prophets later exhorted and taught Israel the path of righteousness before God and before man. The prophets helped Israel denounce her infidelities and inveighed against her injustice and oppression of the poor, of the widow, of the foreigner, and the migrant who lived in their midst. Isaiah called for a figure, a servant of God figure, endowed with the Spirit of God to bring justice to the nations. Indeed, in chapter 42 of Isaiah we read, "This servant of God will faithfully bring forth justice, and he will not grow faint until he has established justice in the land." On this basis, then, what was the message of Jesus? In his own words and quoting from Isaiah, Jesus would say, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and the recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Meanwhile, Matthew, making reference to the same passage, would say that in Jesus, the messianic proclamation of justice to the Gentiles is fulfilled. So, rooted in this biblical heritage, the fathers of the church and some of the great theologians down through the ages developed the moral and social dimensions of our faith. These authoritative sources gave rise in modern times to the Catholic social teaching, which is moral theology based on Christian anthropology, or the discernment about the signs of the times from the point of view of our faith. Its original principle is our creation by God in his image and likeness, and its foundational principle is therefore the equal and the inviolable dignity of the human person. From these flow the rights people enjoy and the duties that they bear concerning their social relations, and these in turn tend towards the common good. And the common good we may define as the sum total of all the conditions of society which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So the Hebrew scriptures then teach the basic social moral principles in terms of the orphan, the widow, the needy, and the stranger. And Jesus wholeheartedly embraced these obligations and brought them to their apex in the parable of the Last Judgment, where those who feed the hungry and visit the sick and the imprisoned will be rewarded. Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, traditionally are called in Catholic circles the corporal works of mercy. And this brings us right into the topic of our gathering this afternoon, globalization and the issues affecting the developing world. Because the basic principles of the church's social teaching have a global reach, and they have a global goal, as expressed by Pope Paul VI in his language in 1967, which said, "The development of the whole man and all of man is the goal of the church's social teaching." When this is the case, then the biggest threat to the integral development of the human person is inequality. Inequality then is the greatest threat today to such a truly integral and indeed global development of the human person and its society. And so the church's social teaching has had a lot to say since 1891, with the time of Rerum Novarum, about the unfair distribution of the earth's resources and of the fruits or benefits of human industry, beginning with Pope Leo XIII, Pius, and Pius XI. Pope John XXIII introduced a very strong and explicit justice perspective, saying the economic prosperity of a nation is not so much its total assets in terms of wealth and property as the equitable division and distribution of this wealth. And John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, and now Pope Francis have amplified on this same theme. Many economists, however, have for too long ignored this factor of inequality. They saw it as an unavoidable side effect of development and argued that if the pie was getting bigger, one had to be patient about its distribution, as the benefits would eventually trickle down to everyone. And this is not referring to only economists here in the United States. A short while ago, about a month ago, I heard a prominent Italian economist also make an observation like, inequality has always been with humanity and humankind. It can never be taken away. What we should be talking about is equality of knowledge. But inequality as an experience in life and society, that is bound to be with humanity. But in what measure do these trickle down? And of what quality and when? So I'm pleased that good economists and outstanding leaders have begun to also focus on the crucial problem of inequality. And by promoting equity and justice as essential, they are catching up with the church's social teaching, which predates today's economic theories and has consistently provided a standpoint from which to urge humanity to fulfill the good. And this is the point of our discussion this afternoon. And this brings me then to the issue of globalization and the developing world. First, let's look at globalization and the globalization challenge which we face. Globalization as such is not new. It is a theme of human history which we can describe in several phases and several moments of our history. For example, Alexander the Great spread the Greek culture, and at the time of Jesus, as you may recall, there was a reference to the popular Greek language which was called the Koine. And everybody knew that Koine referred to the Greek language which had been, if you want, universalized by the conquest of Alexander the Great. And one can describe the same about the Roman conquest. Until in our own day, closer to our own day, we can talk about the European exploitations, colonizations, and imperialistic implantations in Africa, in Asia, and even the Americas. These globalizations, conducted by military might, responded to the desire to go global with commercial and political interests. And they were accompanied by culture and sometimes even by the religious faith. Is contemporary globalization then essentially different? I'd probably say not. Just that instead of military might, it is now market and profit which drives it. The motivation seems similar: to expand interests and to pursue them everywhere. The velocity and the reach seems to be significantly greater, though we are learning that our one world is more and more globalized in a massive but single set of interconnections and interrelationships. And this, environmentally, from weather patterns to pollution, socio-politically, from massive movements of people in search of work to remote control warfare, culturally, where instantaneous information sharing spreads knowledge, fashions, lifestyles, and ideologies, economically, with enhanced mobility of capital, information, labor, raw materials, and manufactured goods. So globalization, though it touches nearly every aspect of life today, is still very hard to grasp systematically. In 2010, the present Pope, then Cardinal Bergoglio, Buenos Aires, used an imagery which I think opens up both its ambiguities and its complexities. He says, if we think about globalization as a uniform billiard ball, the richness of each culture is lost. The true globalization, that which we must defend, is like the polyhedron, in which everyone is integrated, but each player maintains his or her peculiarities, which at the same time enrich others. So we must preserve the diversity and the harmonious unity of humanity. In his great social encyclical called Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI gave this assessment of globalization. He said globalization a priori is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. And so, like natural forces, globalization can have good or bad consequences. But unlike natural forces, it is under human control. Human beings make the policies which drive globalization. And so we should not be its victims. We should rather seek to be its protagonists, acting in the light of reason, guided by charity, and guided by truth. So globalization ought not to put us before a dilemma, either economic prosperity or the common good. On the contrary, the Church's social teaching would have development and even prosperity for the common good, with special responsibility for the poor and the most vulnerable. But reform have to be undertaken with great care. For example, regulations are needed to protect the public from repeated financial and monetary crises. But the same new rules can make it difficult or even impossible for banks to lend to developing countries. And so again, Pope Benedict articulates the foundations of his critique and also of his hopes with globalization. He would say that they do not lie in better economic theory than the ones already available. Rather, the advantages and the good or the bad of globalization are to be found in different dimensions entirely. The transition inherent in the process of globalization presents great difficulties and dangers that can only be overcome if we are able to appropriate the underlying anthropological and ethical spirit that drives globalization towards the common good and towards the development of the human person. With a view then to the common good, Benedict XVI would go on to say that opportunities and dangers weigh heavily upon us in our experience of globalization. Because the processes of globalization, suitably understood and directed, open up the unprecedented possibilities of large-scale redistribution of wealth on a wide scale. If badly directed, however, they can lead to an increase in poverty, in inequality, and could even trigger a global crisis. It is therefore necessary to correct the malfunctions, some of them serious, that cause new divisions between peoples and within peoples, and also to ensure that the redistribution of wealth does not come about through the redistribution or increase of poverty, a real danger if the present situation were to be badly managed. And so wish from this then to draw attention to two crucial points that the Pope makes. The first is this, that much poverty and many divisions, conflicts and sufferings are not just unfortunate collateral damages to be modestly compensated or completely overlooked. No. Their causes are malfunctions, and naming them so is a stern criticism of those responsible for the systems, the policymakers which drive them. The second point made by the Pope speaks of redistribution of wealth. Many misinterpret this call for the redistribution of wealth because it does not mean taxing the legitimate earnings of hard-working individuals to provide handouts to the poor. Coming from Ghana and so from Africa as I do, I can say that the truth lies elsewhere. Maldistribution is not only of income and revenues nowadays from Africa's riches above and below the soil that benefit the extinct owners and investors while Africans themselves suffer. It began with the maldistribution of labor called slavery. It continues with the maldistribution of knowledge, the maldistribution of information, resources, and even trade. These are included in the redistribution of wealth which Pope Benedict XVI is rightly calling for. And their more equitable redistribution will lead to fewer divisions and less disparity of income, earnings, and revenue. And so today, the material resources available for rescuing poor people from poverty are potentially greater than before, but they have ended up largely in the hands of people from developed countries who have benefited more from the liberalization that has occurred in the mobility of capital and labor. The worldwide diffusion of forms of prosperity should not therefore be held up by projects that are self-centered, protectionist, or at the service of private interests. Indeed, the involvement of emerging markets and developing countries allow us to manage the crisis better today, as we shall see later. The critique then and the prescriptions are clear. Efforts at correcting the malfunctions must not be allowed to mask continuing injustice and inequality. We can hope for better outcomes when developing countries are truly participating in global economic and financial decision-making. This would be the much-needed globalization of responsibility. Now, with this general attempt to present the phenomenon itself, let's briefly see some instances and see how this affects the developing world. Globalization, as we've seen, offers very many benefits to developing countries, like Ghana, where I come from, but these benefits have not materialized and will not materialize until there are real changes in attitudes, in approaches, and even in economic policies. Over 500 years ago, very many countries in Africa and Asia made contact with Europe. And from that contact, series of events and developments emerged, which can be referred to as globalized institutions. In these modern times, in the 1960s, emerging markets and developing economies accounted for only about a quarter of the global GDP. Today, it is half that figure. And since 2008, they have been accounting for 3/4 of global economic growth, while the advanced economies tend towards recession. The fastest growing regions in the world, as you very well know, right now are in East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So globalization is leading to great shifts, east and south. Worldwide economic integration over the past decades has led to leaps in innovation, reductions in poverty, and rises in living standards. In China alone, as you know, 500 million people are reported to have been lifted out of poverty over the past few decades. But then you probably would tell me that China doesn't really belong to a developing world. But we can look at examples elsewhere. Globalization, although it's had this positive effect, as it did in Malawi and as it is done in India, but globalization also has done great damage in developing economies. Much of this can be traced to the restoration of a laissez-faire economics in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, according to which private enterprise would best meet the needs and fulfill the desires of the greatest number of people if the market economy were not interfered with by external regulations. We happen to be here in Chicago, so in the US, and several of you may know, as we do outside, that the US President Ronald Reagan in the 1981-89 and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher championed these policies. This liberal market ideology, combined with enhanced communication and transportation, is now the predominant form of globalization. The opening up of economies and markets did not come about by chance. It was deliberately driven in part by the IMF, the World Bank, and sometimes even the US Treasury. Their tacit agreement, known as the Washington Consensus, included a requirement to open capital accounts, reduce the role of governments, and privatize a lot of industries. Thus, it is perhaps disingenuous to claim that economic globalization is a process that evolved on its own and therefore is uncontrollable. The reverse, in fact, is the case. For from many indications, global finance tends to constrain domestic policy choices and thereby undermine economic self-determination. This is the present-day experience of globalization in developing countries like Ghana, like Nigeria, and a whole lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I give the example of Ghana. At independence in 1957, Ghana bounced back vigorously in a lot of industrialization processes under its first president. And in the 1970s, Ghana had industries for producing matches, for canning beef, for producing sugar from sugarcane, and several textile industries, and a glass-making factory. At the beginning of 1991, all of them had gone underground. They had all collapsed. And in the place of that, all of these items now became items that were imported and brought into the country. The local industry could not withstand the pressures that came from competition from the outside world. Perhaps this depended on government policies to protect these factories, but the fact is that it did not. A similar experience is going on right now in a developed country like Italy, whose economy had been resilient because it rested on a lot of family-based industries. In the face of globalization, the family-based industries of Italy, which sustained Italian economy, are also gradually closing because they can also not compete. And again, we might say that it's up to the government to adopt measures that would protect the local and family businesses. So this is the present-day experiences of globalization in developing and even sometimes in developed countries. And the enhanced mobility of capital, goods, people, raw material, and manufactured goods, and the speed of communications and transportation are willingly integrating our economies into the single global market. Investor-friendly conditions, including deregulation, privatization, free trade, and the removal of controls, are imposed in unilateral ways that militate against local production, local industry, and so local trade. Ghana and many other countries south of the Sahara did not struggle for decolonization and political independence, but just to be recolonized economically and deprived of meaningful say. Of course, protectionism did not serve developing countries very well. It often led to the economic stagnation and corruption, but we still ask, why can Ghana and countries like Ghana not have their own textile industry, sugar industry, lumbering industry, the processing of raw materials which are mined in all of these countries because of labor? But it has become now the thing that it's far cheaper for all of these countries to import all of these items than to produce them locally. The result, of course, is a lot of unemployment. So massive resource exploitation destabilizes communities for whom the land, the forest, the rivers represent their livelihood and are the basis for their way of life. In some mining areas, there is violence, while ethanol, producing agriculture, or the production of jatropha for biodiesel, forcefully displace people from their lands, heightening or making the poverty experience of people still deeper. So impressive rates of growth are coupled with so much ongoing and pervasive poverty. There is a paradox here that the growth or the recovery does not translate into improved living standards for the majority of citizens. And so when given a narrow fixation on investment yields and maximum profit, globalization does not make for an equitable spread of wealth and the promotion of human flourishing. As long as globalization is unfairly tilted in favor of the already developed economies, and as long as it is made to serve the strongest, local economies are squeezed out, and the imbalances, the inequalities, and indeed injustices and sufferings are allowed to continue with little or no improvement. So as evidence of how African countries lose out, this year's Africa Progress Report calculates that African countries lose $38 billion a year through tax havens, while foreign aid adds up to only about $30 billion. It warns that Africa's strongest trajectory of economic growth, which will see the region increase the pace of growth well beyond 5% over the next 2 years, is at risk because of rising inequality and the marginalization of whole sectors of the society. This shows that the Washington consensus wasn't too successful, It failed to take into account the huge rise in inequality within countries and the fact that what is good for financial market is often not good for the people. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of this crisis. People have learned from past mistakes, for example, that the IMF is much more sensitive to these issues today than in the past. Kofi Annan, who chairs the body that produced this report, states that Africa's governments must, as a matter of urgency, turn their attention to those who are being left behind. Making globalization work requires paying critical attention to it. So what can the church contribute to reflections on these issues, and what activities then can it address? The contributions of the church we can look at under the topic of humanizing globalization or making globalization fair. And we can probably consider this part of reflection. How can we humanize globalization, or how can we make globalization a fair experience of all sectors affected by it? In the paper as distributed, there are 7 points given to help this. I just want to crunch them all together on the four, if you want, crucial key titles. Because in the year 1995, my predecessor to the office in Rome, which I now occupy, one Cardinal Martino, joined the ILO at a conference in Copenhagen. The conference was organized and was called the Summit for the study of the social dimensions of globalization, because it observed that policies were concentrated around the way economics work and not the way societies work. And that policies were organized around market values and not around people values. And so they realized that there was an evolving ethical vacuum in which globalization operates. And so, after that, of course, our office participated by way of contributing considerations like the church's social teaching and the way that it promotes ethics and values in economics. And so at the end of it, putting it all, it makes me sum up the 7 key areas which are proposed as a way of getting out of this in 4 crucial, if you want, maxims or guidelines. And the first of it is this: to make decent work a global goal. By way of humanizing globalization or making it fair, we need to make decent work a global goal. And it just means that if globalization spreads the distribution of items, as one Filipino peasant observed, what is the point of globalization bringing within my reach a child's shoes when the purchase of that shoe will cost me my job? And being here in the United States, you're probably familiar with a saying from Henry Ford, which was repeated later on by the leader of the labor leader, Walter Reuther. And he has something like this to say: we cannot have a car economy based on bicycle wages. And that just means that globalizing decent work simply calls on all of us to ensure that workers receive fair, decent wages, and that they can contribute to globalization by constituting and becoming a market, that the consumers must have something that they can do to this. So in justice then, and in fairness, the rights of capital cannot be better protected than the rights of the workers. The second guideline or focus statement that I want to make is to focus on fairness. The technology driving globalization may be irreversible, but the policymakers behind globalization can certainly change their mind. That part is reversible and it can change. They are established by policymakers and they can be changed, and they can make them more fair, equitable, and ensure the dignity of the human person. It was Pope John Paul II who said, for example, that globalization is a reality present today in every area of our human lives, but it is a reality that must be managed and managed wisely. And he suggested solidarity as a way of managing globalization. Therefore, there is the need for fair rules for trade, fair rules for migration, fair rules for capital flows, and fair rules for debt burdens, better access to market, and more democratic global decision-making to provide developing countries with more space in which to live and to work. So there is the need, if you want, for an affirmative action for the weak and developing countries, the opposite of the winner-takes-it-all mentality which dominates economics this day. The third guideline is this, that we also need to try to localize globalization. And localizing globalization simply means that we need to consider the local basis of all what globalization means and contributes. The imbalance between attention given to facilitating global finance, global trade, and global investment and interest must match the interest in reinforcing local communities, local entrepreneurship, and local markets. But there cannot be a successful globalization without successful localization. In other words, there cannot be successful globalization without successful local market, successful consuming power, successful people to provide precisely what globalization calls for. And this means that through the principle of subsidiarity, globalization must begin to recognize that it should help certain local industries to attain a level which can make them equal partners in trade. This effectively also is a position that was expressed by German Secretary of International Cooperation and Aid at a meeting called TICAD, Tokyo International Meeting for Africa. His name was Ushi Aida. This secretary said that cooperation means to realize a vision together with the people in Africa, the vision of Africa that is modern, independent, where self-confident African men and women shape their own life and their own future and pursue their own part of a sustainable and democratic development. So it calls for a certain amount of recognition of what is possible to be done in local situations. The fourth and the final guideline that can probably help us humanize globalization or help us develop a fair globalization from the 7 points made is to rethink global governance. Because to reap the full effect of good national governance, we need good global governance. There's the need to improve on how global institutions perform and talk to each other. And this is crucial. Elsewhere in our own office and dicastery, seeing that a whole lot of features institutions have become global and therefore beyond the competence of individual single states to deal and to manage with them, we did call at one point, in line with Pope Paul and Pope John Paul II and now Benedict XVI, we call for a global public authority. as a way of managing some of this. But some form of global governance is necessary since and because a whole lot of the global institutions go beyond the competence of individual single states. Individual single states or institutions cannot deal and manage features which have become global. There is a need for some form of global governance. Can be the United Nations, reformed to represent all the nations, or can be some other body. But the reality is this, that how do we manage globalization, global institutions with national governments and national competent groups? So there is the need also for some rethinking our global governance issues. So my dear friends, with these four kind of guidelines of catchphrases, we hope to have captured or put together the 7 points in the text, which may be before you, which you read later, about how to get globalization out of all the criticisms which are sometimes addressed to it, to humanize it and make it a little bit more fair. Because ultimately, God is the creator of all, the cosmos and the human race. And this makes us humans with all our diversity interrelatedly one, interdependently one, and co-responsible for our common will, the common good. This principle founds the ethics with which we would humanize our globalized and globalizing world. And so, remembering John the 23rd at 50 this year, enlightened by the teaching of Benedict XVI, and inspired by the focus and the energy of Pope Francis, let people of goodwill collaborate in developing and humanizing our global world so that it will be worthy of the one who created it and saw that everything that he had created was good and indeed very good. I'd like to thank you, Eminences, my Lord Archbishop and Bishop, for your kind attention, and look now to the respondents. Thank you.
My name is Russell Hittinger. I am with Marianne Glendon, the co-chair of the Lumen Christi program in Catholic Social Thought. I will introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. First, I would like to introduce Robert Lucas, who is the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor of Economics here at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1974. Professor Lucas is past president of both the American Economic Association and the Econometrics Society, and is a member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1995. His work has truly transformed the discipline with fundamental contributions across the field of macroeconomics, including labor supply, monetary policy, asset pricing, firm size distributions, business cycles, and methodology. For the past 25 years, however, his work has focused on growth and development, emphasizing that the creation and diffusion of new ideas and technologies is a key to economic development, and that human capital investment, international trade, and urban centers are critical in these processes. Professor Luigi Zingales is the Robert C. McCormick Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business, where he has taught since 1992. His scholarly contributions span from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture, including the importance of societal trust. His popular books include Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists and A Capitalism for the People, Recapturing the Lost Genius of American Prosperity. All of these reflecting his very broad interests. He also serves on the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, which has been examining the legislative, regulatory, and legal issues affecting how public companies function. He was awarded the 2003 Bonasser Prize for the Best Young European Financial Economist. And Joseph Kaboski is the David F. and Aaron M. Seng Foundation Professor of Economics at the University of Notre Dame and the Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research focuses on growth, development, and international economics. He has been published in top journals, including the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and the Journal of the European Economic Association. Professor Kaboski has been a consultant for several Federal Reserve banks, the World Bank, and the IMF. He has also led a joint research project with Catholic Relief Services evaluating poverty programs in East Africa. In 2012, he was awarded the prestigious Frisch Medal for his paper evaluating the impacts of microfinance in Thailand. So I would like to invite the panelists to come up.
Well, there's no question that Cardinal Turkson's eloquent statement addresses issues of great importance. In today's world, there are millions of people living at subsistence levels of income. There are also millions of people living in societies where incomes routinely double once every generation. So the gap between these two grows larger and larger every year. How could we not be concerned? I'm not going to cover anything like the scope of Cardinal Turkson's discussion, but I'll talk about some related issues. I'm going to begin by quoting myself. The last pair, I wrote an essay called "The Industrial Revolution: Past and Future," and I'm going to read the last parts of the last paragraph. First part: in this very minute, a child is being born to an American family, and another child, equally valued by God, is being born to a family in India. The resources of all kinds that will be at the disposal of this new American will be on the order of 15 times the resources available to his Indian brother. This seems to us a terrible wrong, justifying corrective action, and perhaps some actions of this kind can and should be taken. I think the values in these lines accord well with those expressed so well by Cardinal Turkson. I'm not so optimistic about the lines that followed. But of the vast increase in the well-being of hundreds of millions of people that has occurred in the 200-year course of the Industrial Revolution, virtually none of it can be attributed to the direct redistribution of resources from rich to poor. The potential for improving the lives of poor people by finding different ways of distributing current production is nothing compared to the apparently unlimited potential of increasing production. So I'd like to spend my time describing some of the evidence that has led me to this view. Now I'm sort of on thin ice here. Okay.
Okay.
Now how do I get it?
We got a piece of paper.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, I want to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and here it is. Everybody in the world is on there, except you have to be around after 1700 and get born before 2009. So I've lumped the whole world into six categories. I'll talk about it, and at some point we're going to have to get into a little bit more detail, but I want to have something I can show on one screen. Now, the thing starts in 1700, so Abraham and Jesus aren't on there, but look, there's not much going on from 1800 on back. So if we ran the whole thing back to Abraham's day, it wouldn't really change the picture very much. It would just squeeze all the interesting stuff farther out into the corner. So the Industrial Revolution is a fairly new thing. and what's new about it, and it's shown on this picture, is that across, I mean, we've always had inequalities within societies. They can be dealt with, and we can argue about how to deal with them, but that's not going to be the subject of my talk. What's new, it came with the Industrial Revolution, is this huge inequality across societies, and that's a new thing. I mean, new since the late 18th, early 19th century. There may be a factor of 2 differences between the richest and the poor back in the 1700s, but a factor of 2 is nothing compared to what we're going to see as we proceed to the right. So the top 2 curves are basically, you know, Western Europe and then the European populated colonies of England. I should say that all this data is from the late economist Angus Maddison, and it's maintained by the OECD, and it's kind of pretty gross data, and you can imagine the evidence getting back into the 18th century is a little fuzzy. It gets better and better as time passes. Then the next 2 curves, I'm going to call all these top 4 Europeans, even though, you know, most of our societies, all of them now involve people from all ancestries. So I mean by European, basically European dominated or European ruled or something in that category. The red curve is the Eastern Europe, and the green curve is Latin America. So I'm thinking of those as the unsuccessful Europeans. But compared to the rest of the world, you know, they're rich too. And the bottom 2 curves are the purple one is Asia, but this is including everything from, you know, Syria on to Indonesia, and then the bottom curve is Africa. And, you know, these curves set 3/4 of the people in the world now live in the bottom 2 curves. So we're not. You got to keep that in mind to talk about the issues that the Cardinal and I and all the rest of us want to talk about. So the initial, you know, the Industrial Revolution started in England, I suppose, and spread quickly to people who do a lot of business or have a lot of interchange with England, like the English colonies and northwestern Europe. Sorry. Maybe that's all I need to say. You're slow to take off. By 1900, there's about a factor of 5 between the poorest countries and the richest. But a factor of 5, we way outstripped that in the years that have passed. Now notice that there's a lot of interchange between Europeans and the people in Africa and Asia during this period too, but it didn't seem to, that kind of interaction, kind of colonial rule was not conducive to transmission of ideas and technology and wealth to the people being ruled over. And the colonial age is just pretty much flat. While all this growth was going on in the European countries, pretty much nothing is going on in the colonized countries, or in the countries like China that, while not quite colonized, were definitely pushed around by the Europeans. So the interesting part of that really starts with independence. I mean, the diffusion of of the Industrial Revolution to Asia and Africa is really a post-independence event. But look at how it, and I want to talk about that. You can see the boom in Asia, and this includes not just China and the miracle economies, but also Bangladesh, Pakistan, some of the India. So it's an amazing feat, and I want to talk about it. And you can see that Africa too. You can talk about Africa as a very distressed continent, and has been left out of a lot of this progress. But it's not worse off now than it was in the colonial age. I'll give you some numbers, but there's been substantial development. Cardinal Turkson, who knows this stuff much more than I do, talked about some examples in Ghana. So let me use some. So let me switch to just focusing on the year since, like, I'm sorry, this thing is, I can't quite put my, and talk about some numbers that refer to this the post-1960 period. Because the post-colonial age, things took off in a way that is just completely unprecedented. And the main players were the people in this bottom 75% of the world's population. And the economic growth during the year since 1960 has far outpaced the growth performance of earlier centuries. Now keep in mind when I talk about numbers that the leading economies, the UK and the US, grow at about 3% a year, total GDP, total production, and per capita incomes grow at about 2% a year. So that's the norm for the successful economies. From 1960 to 2009, GDP in the entire world grew at 4%, about 2% in population growth, about 2% so economic growth was the same for the whole world, and in some ways exceeded the growth rate of the very wealthiest countries in the world. It was a remarkable event. It involved a six-fold increase in total world production. People talk about a population explosion with some alarm, and there was plenty of population growth, but production growth has far exceeded in most parts of the world production has exceeded population growth. Now in Asia, it's even more remarkable, and here I'm using a very broad definition. Don't just think of China. It over this period grew at 5.4%. So it's a 13-fold increase in production in Asia between 1960 and 2008. And this event, this is not a matter of a few financiers getting rich at the expenses of poor people. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about hundreds of millions of families who for the first time in their lives got access to clean water, indoor plumbing, reduced infant mortality rates, longer lives, education for girls and boys both, healthy diets, some degree of autonomy in life decisions. This was a huge change in the well-being of millions and millions of people. It didn't solve all the world's, but it was a huge step forward, and in some sense a really glorious event. It should give us all pleasure just to think of it. Now, it's not fair to say that, well, China is not an undeveloped country. China was dirt poor when this started, and most of it was kept in poverty by the communist government. And so, when it blossomed, it really took off. Now, Africa, since GDP growth has been 3% since independence. I'm talking about the whole continent again. It's not just sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a four-fold increase in that period. It's a disappointment compared to Asia, but as I said before, it's improvement in the lives of Africans relative to the standard during the colonial age. So I want to get a little more close-up picture of the post-1960 era, and what I'm going to do is use a diagram, and I drew the picture here, but I got the idea from a paper by Jeff Sachs and Andrew Warner from 1995. And what they're doing is this: on this axis, on the x-axis, the bottom line, it's per capita income. Each dot is a country in this picture, and so 112 countries. We got a lot of them, and this is per capita income in 1960. So I'm looking at the countries where countries stood in income levels when, roughly speaking, independence occurred for the colonies, and then the other axis is the annual growth rate averaged for each country from 1960 to 2000, so 40-year period. So you can see the rich countries mostly hover around 2%. That's the 2% I told you, and that's going to be Western, the UK, US, Canada, but then as you go back to the poor countries with 2,000 or 1,000, Ghana is going to be about 1,400. These are all measured in US $1990. The whole thing just spreads out. You see this triangle, a huge variation between some countries and other countries. A lot of the countries in the bottom half are negatively. They're poorer in 2000 than they were in 1960. In the top half, you get countries that have grown at 6% averaged over 4 years. That's as compared to, say, 2% for the United States. So these countries, the ones at the top are catching up, and the ones at the bottom aren't. And there's a huge variation across countries. Now, I'm not going to name every dot. I could name a lot of them. But I don't want to do that, and I don't want to get into anecdotes, but I want to talk about two countries. I'll talk about Ghana and South Korea. In the 1960s, Ghana was this is all this Madison data, $1,400 US per person, and this is averaged in the rich and the poor, and then in South Korea it'd be 1,200. So you can see there those in 1960. Now Ghana's growth rate is pretty near zero. Sorry, I can't really point to these dots. But you just go up right in the middle there and get to the zero line, and there's 4 dots there. One of them's Ghana, and I don't know which one. Now, if you want to get to South Korea, you got to go all the way to the top, and you see that top dot. That's South Korea. And what do these numbers mean? Well, they mean that in 2008, Ghana had grown to $1,600 a person, and North Korea had grown to about $20,000. So Korea is now almost as wealthy as their former colonial ruler, the Japanese. Now, for me, this is globalization. Globalization means the free trade regime that was set up by the wealthy countries after the war, the European Union, which really started it all. But it was a union that wasn't raised against the United States and Japan and the other countries. They didn't raise tariffs. So we all had basically a free trade arrangement from North America, Japan, and Europe. There was no centralized world planning here, and there was a room for a lot of variation in economic policies between different countries. So the Europeans had a much more intense welfare state than the United States and the Japanese had, for example. And there was no reason to, each country could go with whatever it wanted. And prosperity was just tremendous. It was everybody gained. I mean, everybody in the club gained. It was not something like at the expense of the United States or it wasn't at the expense of anybody. And then the question is, well, what about all the people who weren't in the club, like South Korea or Taiwan or you know, all of Africa, all the colonial world, and they went in different. Oh no, what have I done now? It's tough to have your desk be the touchpad. It doesn't work. All right. So here's what Sachs and Warner did. They classified every one of these dots as an open economy or a closed economy, and it's a complicated classification. They have a country by country discussion of how they get classified, but basically, you got to have your tariffs can't be too high. You can't have a lot of quotas on imports. You can't have currency controls. You can't have a marketing board. That's an African scheme invented by the British, I think, where your farmers sell the crop to the government, and the government resells it at a better price and keeps the difference. These kind of interventions, if you had any one of these things, you're closed, according to Sachs and Warner. This is obviously some arbitrariness here, and otherwise you're open. So the blue dots are all the open ones. They're the ones who bought into this globalization and participated in it. Now, if you take a look, you can see some blue dots. You can see some blue dots mixed in with the red ones. So it's not that openness, as Sachs and Warner define it, was a surefire winner. The dots tend to be the big Asian, the red dot, big Asian, primarily agricultural economies like Indonesia and Thailand. India and Pakistan, Bangladesh are all red dots. They just have huge barriers to trade and huge barriers to pretty much everything. Well, not enough, I guess, to protect workers and anyway. And then there's communist China's way up there, and the highest red dot, and that's because Sachs and Warner said if you were a communist, you couldn't, they wouldn't classify you as, fair enough. But this, there's obviously a lot of arbitrariness as to how you're classifying these countries. I think these guys did a good job of it, and so I'm trying to use it. So basically, I see globalization, if it means free trade, and more or less freedom of individuals, by an individual level. I'm not talking about swaps between the Soviet Union and their satellites. I'm talking about free people doing business with people in other countries on terms that is mutually satisfactory. If that's globalization, then it seems to me the more of it, the better. I would say if your country gets invited into this club, take it. It can't hurt, it might help. Let me go back to my first slide. I'm going to wrap up here. We're talking about this growth of inequality, and both Cardinal Turkson and I were even. Isn't that what you see there? It just seems like these gaps are just growing without bound. We're on this, and is this the trajectory that? Now I'm going to conclude with a slide that looks at the same history, but in a way that it's more illuminates some other features of that history. What I did here, again, this is the whole world. I'm calling all the top 4 countries European countries. and everything except Asia and Africa, and I'm calling Asia and Africa non-European. That's pretty coarse, but that's what I need to do to get this picture. Now, and then what I plotted on is the European share in world population, which was about 25% back in 1700, and the European share in production, which was slightly higher. According to Madison's data, this is really controversial. The Europeans were more productive even back then. In any event, the Industrial Revolution kicks in a way that affects large masses of people. I'm not saying there weren't interesting inventions made, but I'm talking about things that affect the lives of masses of working people. That blue curve, one of the features of the Industrial Revolution was that the European countries started having more bigger families, which is exactly what African people are doing right now too. There's nothing specifically African about choosing larger families when you have more income to spend. Every society does that. But the European share in production of goods took off much steeper, and you get this huge gap between a smaller fraction of the population, 30% of the population producing 70% of the goods and having 70% of the income. So that's the Industrial Revolution up to the mid 20th century, and then the thing starts turning around, European share in population is falling, partly because as the Asian and African countries started to get more productive, they started having the bigger families, but while the non-European share in populations, it still hasn't got down. It's down to, it's about the same as it was back in the 17th century, 18th century, and the production curve is falling way down. So I start out by saying that this inequality that the Industrial Revolution created, it's an unnatural thing in a way, and it's been not true in most of world history, and it seems to me it can't persist. I mean, we have about the same kind of talent in every continent. Why should one set of people be permanently better off than some other set of people? And I think it's not going to be that way. I think this you can see we had a huge turning point there, I think, and no one knows where it's headed. But my prediction, you guys know about economist predictions. So, but I'm hoping that by 2100, that we're all going to be about the same in terms of cost countries. We'll all be equal as we were back in the 18th century. But will that mean we didn't make any progress? No, I think instead of being equally poor and stagnant, our economies are going to be equally rich and dynamic. But we're not there yet.
The Cardinal and I are kind of in the same line of business. The business of increasing people's well-being. Now, of course, we have a very different approach. I'm an economist, and I mainly focus on the material dimension of well-being, and Cardinal Turkson is a religious leader and focuses on the spiritual dimension of well-being. However, the two aspects are clearly linked. It's difficult to achieve well-being without the material dimension, and it's also difficult to do so without the spiritual one. So I think that the two are intrinsically related, and part of what I'm going to discuss is how important it is to link the two. The second dimension in which I feel some sympathy is that we both try a multidisciplinary approach. Now, to try this requires a lot of courage, because if you're an expert in a field, venturing in another one exposes you to the risk of making mistakes, which sort of is unpleasant, especially at an older age. And however, I've learned over the years it's only by committing these mistakes that we learn. So when I will try to sort of link with Catholic social teaching, which I know very little. I'm prone to make mistakes, and I'm sure that Cardinal will correct my mistakes. But I think that that's a way we learn everywhere, but in particular so at the University of Chicago, where we're not afraid of making mistakes if at the end we learn in the process. So let me start on the safer ground, and in part sort of Bob anticipated me, but I want to talk about sort of globalization and this negative aspect that Cardinal Turkson was talking about. In particular, I think Bob has a much longer view of mine. He started from the 1700. I want to just limit to the later part, really the peak of globalization that started since 1980. And Cardinal Turkson said that this is the period of free market. In fact, a colleague called it the age of Milton Friedman, because many of the ideas championed by Milton Friedman were actually applied and became policy thanks to sort of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and many others. Now, one question is sort of this period such a bad period for the world, or such a bad period for poor country in general? Now, since the 1980, the world per capita income at today's level of dollars grew up sort of from $2,700 to $12,000. Now, of course, you want to see sort of across different groups. And here, the developing countries started, of course, from a much lower level. However, their rate of increase was much faster than the one of developed countries. Now, clearly, the bar, the red bar is much larger for the developed countries, because even if you grow at a lower rate, but if you start from a higher number, in terms of dollars, you make more. But the rate of growth of developing countries was much faster in the period 1980 to 2000 than it was in the period 1960 to 1980. The other way around for the developed countries. So the age of Milton Friedman was actually a pretty good age for the developing countries that were catching up. Now, as a spiritual leader, you might say, you know, money does not provide happiness. Now, this is hard to establish behind reasonable doubt, but economists recently have started to make some effort in this dimension, looking at sort of some self-reported measures of happiness. And Deaton and Stone said the answer is yes. It does actually provide, not a huge amount, but it does. If you take a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst possible life, and 10 represents the best possible life for you, then we know that increasing income does increase your happiness at a rate of not a great rate. So doubling your income increases your happiness by half a point in that scale. And so over 30 years, you increase 1.5. Now you say, this is not a lot, but what is the alternative? So similar papers that look at the effect of being religious on this dimension, and is not that great either, and is one-off. In a sense, if you are religious on average, this corresponds to a 10% increase in income. Now you apply the previous sort of coefficient, you see that doesn't increase your happiness quite a bit. Apparently in the United States, this seems a much better deal, or at least a better deal is a 50% increase in income. But you know, that's once and for all. If you are religious, income can keep growing, at least in this model, religiosity not. So this is saying it's not that bad. Now, let's look also at the distributional aspect, because Cardinal Turkson clearly emphasized the distributional aspect. And the good news is, in the age of Milton Friedman, actually the inequality at the world level went down quite a bit. This is some work by Saleh Martin looking at, this is a measure that economists look, is basically the concentration when is sort of the number is 1, the wealth is entirely concentrated, and when is sort of 0, is perfectly distributed. And here it went down, maybe you say not enough, but it went down over this period. And if you look at another measure that people often use, is what fraction of the population is the poverty rate. You find that everywhere in the world except I'm sorry to say, and this is maybe is a negative view of Cardinal Turkson, except Africa, this went down quite a bit in the last 30 years, or 20 or 30 years. And this is the percentage of people that live with $1.5 a day. And as you can see, everywhere went down except in Africa. But I have to say, in Africa, it's hard to argue that it didn't go down because of free markets and free trade, because even economists that are not can be charged of being sympathetic with the Chicago view, Acemoglu and Robinson, they are from MIT and Harvard, they do say that the poverty of Africa is due to the poverty of their political institutions that actually do not favor protection of property rights, do not favor free market, and maybe they are a legacy of the colonialistic period. I think that's absolutely true. However, even the institutions they had before colonialism were not that great, and this is something that we definitely need to work if we want to improve the situation in Africa. And I think that one aspect I disagree with Cardinal Turkson is on the comparison between the last 20 or 30 years and colonialism. In a sense, I think there is a gigantic difference between the two, and is the aspect that many non-economists tend to ignore, which is competition. The large multinationals who try to enter Africa to find natural resources and new markets are not necessarily any better than the armies that were going down to try to find gold or try to take slaves. The difference is that those armies were establishing a monopoly of the use of force, and that's what colonialism is about. The multinationals are competing one against the other. And it is competition that protects the poor. It is the competition, as Bob was saying, that made Korea so successful. It's not because any of the multinational, American multinational or British multinationals wanted to develop Korea, but it is the competition for the workforce that brought jobs, that brought innovation, technology, as it is the competition today that brings a lot of firms from throughout the world to invest in China and bring up the standard of living in China. So I think that aspect is the aspect that I think is maybe ignored, not so much emphasized in the Catholic social teaching. I think that starting with Leo's 13 Rerum Novarum, I think that the Catholic thinking tried to integrate or try to give some discipline to the behavior of the economic agents was extremely helpful and to some extent very far-sighted. And at the basis of this view, there is a full recognition on the importance of property rights and the importance of freedom of contracts. In his teaching, Leo says, let the working man and the employer make free agreements. So these aspects, which are very dear to us here at the University of Chicago, are protected and recognized. What they do add, which is an important component, is a concern that the poor might be exploited, that the bargaining power is not always in the right place, and that's the reason why they want to put restriction and protection to the poor, which I think many people today will agree with. What the other part that I like is that they add to the law or to force norms also a moral dimension. So in their view, charity and the interest for the poor is not necessarily a forced redistribution, but it's a moral obligation of the right man or woman. Now, at the face of it, this might seem a bit far from what many people consider the traditional Chicago view of economics. This view is mostly associated with Milton Friedman and Joe Stigler and emphasizes the superiority of free markets and the danger of any form of government intervention. In Stigler's words, any form of regulation is inevitably distorted in favor of the regulated, so rather than fixing possible market failures, it only exacerbates them. There is, however, an older Chicago tradition that goes back to Henry Simon, who in 1934 wrote a very influential pamphlet called A Positive Program for Laissez-faire. Writing in the aftermath of the Great Depression, Simon criticizes government intervention, but also the excessive power monopolies and the extreme income inequality. And I think that there is now an attempt to sort of merge these two different views into a new Chicago view that shares with Friedman and Stigler the faith in free market as a superior form to organize an economy. Yet, unlike Friedman and Stigler, but very much like Simons, it is concerned about the institutional fragility of free market system, which is threatened by economic monopolies, but even more so by political powers that sort of are supported by these economic monopolies. It is concern of income inequality, not so much for the reason that Cardinal Turkson is saying, even if those are extremely important, but it's concern for the political consequences of this inequality that creates inside a country and across country an unequal political power. Like Stigler and Friedman, but unlike Simons, this sort of view is very suspicious of government intervention, which is regarded as mostly captured by incumbents that conspire, to use Adam Smith's words, to restrict trade. This is where maybe the Cardinal's view and the New Chicago view differ the most. The Cardinal is trusting the guidance of our mighty Lord, and so believes in the power of the superior authority aimed at the common good. However, Cardinal Turkson himself is very critical of existing institutions like the IMF, which, using the Chicago language, have been captured by vested interests. In this case, the vested interests are some powerful organization in the United States, but the principle is always the same. So I think that there are a lot of points in common, especially if we understand, and sort of, I think this is where I hope to help the Cardinal and the sort of view of the Chicago social theory understand the difference between what I call a pro-market view and a pro-business view. Most people think they are one and the same. But it's not true, because the typical businessman or businesswoman like free market only when they are entering a new industry. The moment they are in an industry, they want to increase barrier to entry to make profits. And to some extent, this is healthy to the extent these barriers are created through a technological lead, a reputation, a better product. Is unhealthy when you use the power of the government to enforce those barriers to entry. And this is where my fear of sort of the central authority, precisely because I don't share the same faith in a good central planner that maybe Cardinal Turkson has. That's the reason why I fear the central authorities, that they tend not necessarily to enhance the public good, but they tend to enhance the current elite. The moment you introduce some restriction to trade, not only you slow down growth, as Bob said, but you run the risk of favoring the most vocal part of the population at the expenses of everybody else. Now, I want to conclude with a request. Unlike me, who is, as I said, I'm a Pauli professor, Cardinal Turkson is also a man of power, one of the most prominent figures in what I consider, and probably is, the oldest, largest, and most powerful organization in the world, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has done a tremendous effort in improving the view of the world, in spreading the good word, in introducing important social norms that I consider very important also for economics. However, they have not done the same in practice when it comes to the world of finance. Cardinal Turkson has spoken very aggressively and very correctly against the distortion that the world of finance has created, and it's absolutely true. However, if there is something that is worse than the world of finance, is the world of Vatican finance. And I think that here I really invite sort of the new Pope, which comes from the New World, and Cardinal Turkson, that comes from the New World, to bring some cleanness in the world of Vatican finance, which has proven by example how corrupt finance can be. You know, the IOR, the Istituto Opere Religiose, is the Vatican bank, which over the years have been involved with the mafia, the bribes, the politicians who are connected with the mafia, and without ever facing the truth. And you know that just before Benedict XVI stepped down, he asked for a commission to do a inquiry over the role of the IOR, and there is a report that 3 cardinals have written. This report has been given only to the new Pope, and I hope that in the name of transparency, which is important in the development of finance, in the development of free trade, in the development of a better world, this report will be made public. And so my request for Cardinal Turkson is to make as much as possible to make this report public. Thank you.
I share some of Luigi's trepidation. It's not every day that an economist is asked to discuss a paper by the Cardinal of the Church. In economics, there's a lot of different ways to approach discussions. The lower forms are, offering just praise and flattery, or nitpicking and critique, and they grow up from there to trying to read the paper and digest and clarify and maybe even extend the results. But I think the most masterful discussions, and I think every academic will agree with me, the one that we all aspire to, is to digest and extend the author's work in such a way that it segues into our own research. And I don't apologize for 2 reasons. Maybe I lack Luigi's courage. The other reason is neither of the other discussants brought up my research. But the third reason is that I thought Cardinal Turkson was absolutely correct. As a development economist, the idea that you have to have a firm commitment, a true commitment to justice and charity in the world, especially as a Christian, is absolutely correct. Bob talked about it. One half of the world, every other person in the world, lives on less than $2.50 a day. Many of them much less than $2.50 a day. So I think we need a big commitment to that, but I think we also need a strong commitment to research, and that's why I don't apologize. Research that's on important topics like this, and I view research as a vocation. So let me tell you a little bit about my some work. I agree with Bob that when you look at poverty in the world, just 1 out of every 2 people, the main reason that people are poor happens to be the country they were born in. And so from that standpoint, economic development is a macroeconomic problem. So I'm going to give some macroeconomic data. It's not that I don't care about people. I've done research on the ground. But I think this is interesting, and it will tie in with the issues of globalization, even more so of economic development and broader human flourishing. This is some data Paco Buera, who's out there somewhere, and I have collected. Each dot here is a country, and we have 2 centuries of growth. So each dot, every decade we have a dot, and it tells you the fraction of the economy that's in agriculture, that's in manufacturing, and that's in services. And if you just look at the data, it's not very informative, unfortunately. When you look across time, you can't see the Great Depression, you can't see World War II, any of these big things, and you can't really see the age of globalization either. you will see a bit of a rise in services over time and some fall in agriculture as we go down in time. But if we look at this from a different lens, since this is about developing countries, let me blow up the picture on agriculture. So there's the data on agriculture. And now let me change the lens that we look through this on. So I'm gonna take replace this bottom axis from time to income per capita. So the average level of wealth in a country. And all of a sudden the picture clears up dramatically. We see this decline in agriculture. So over time, poor countries start out largely agrarian, and over time they grow to basically the agricultural sector almost disappearing as a fraction of income. If we do this for manufacturing and services, it also offers some clarity. We see the rise of manufacturing, and then the eventual decline as incomes rise, and then we say this takeoff in services. This is a cause for alarm among many people, all three of these patterns. I would expect that if, Bob talked about economist predictions, so take this with a grain of salt, but if the next generation were to reconvene 50 years from now here, I think the picture for manufacturing would look a lot like the picture for agriculture, which is that it would be going down towards zero. Right now, 1 in 10 workers is, manufacturing in the United States, industry has been declining for 50 years. 1 in 10 workers is in manufacturing. I think that'll go close to zero, something like agriculture. What does that mean? Does that mean, Cardinal Turkson talked about, quality jobs being important. Does this mean that we're moving toward an economy of mixed jobs? Is services going to reign supreme? Well, if we decompose the service industry into high-skill services and low-skill services, you can see that this isn't the case at all. The low-skill services, actually, as income rises, those go down. And it's all the high-skill services which is driving this growth. So what are these high-skill services? What are the things that I predict will dominate the economy as we move forward, or as developing countries move forward? Now, here they are. So this is 50-year change, and this is the skill intensity of the industry. And these high-skill industries are health, education, business, hospitals, banking, these kind of usual suspects. You can see eating and drinking places, the MIC jobs. It's in the northwest quadrant. It is positive. It's a growing industry, but that's not what's driving service growth. And then you can see all the other low-skill services that are declining over time. Let's return now to the decline of agriculture. I guess there's a couple questions. One is, why is this happening? And the second is, what does this mean for us as a society? What does this mean for human flourishing? I think that, the fact that these, I mentioned, predictions and what's going to be the world's going to look like in 2050. And I think that's because these patterns are so striking and so strong that it leads me to think that they'll continue. I guess that opens me up to the criticism that, I've ignored maybe human freedom, or I'm viewing the economy from a mechanistic worldview, and that's not true at all. The first is the first thing is you can look. Not every country is the same. There's a lot of variation. So there's room for differences in institutions and differences in culture. These are also average numbers. So there's individuals that do very different things. There's individual free will. But I think what these pictures are capturing is that there's a basic commonality. There's something about human nature. There's something about the nature of the world. There's something Catholic about the human experience, Catholic with a little c. And so, what are the explanations that economists basically go to? The first explanation is a demand explanation. Economists, call it demand, and we talk about preferences. But what does this really mean? It essentially reflects that human persons, endowed with will and reason, pursue a hierarchy of needs and wants. Food and other agricultural commodities are necessities, and as income increases, people spend less and less of a share of their income on food, and they move on to other things, like high-skill services. They become relatively important when your basic needs are met. So that's the first, and that is again, this is human beings with reason and will choosing, what to make and what to consume. The second is a supply explanation, and it comes from the nature of work and technology. And here the idea is that productivity growth is faster in industries like agriculture and manufacturing, and slower in services. We can do large-scale mechanized agriculture. We can do the same with manufacturing. Baumel's famous example of the slow productivity growth in services, he said, after 200 years, it still takes 4 people just as long to play one of Beethoven's string quartets. It's a witty statement, that's why I used it, but it exaggerates things a bit. After all, we can now translate that same performance, that string quartet performance, into an MP3 file that millions of users can download into their iPod at the press of a button. So it's not that there's no productivity growth in services. And actually, when we look at which of these demand and these supply explanations are quantitatively most important, when you look at the decline of agriculture going into manufacturing, that's mainly driven by this demand effect, that food is a necessity good. And so throughout history, most of our resources have been used to provide our daily bread. When we look at the movement from manufacturing into services, it looks like it's about half and half demand and half this biased productivity. But either way, globalization, I want to emphasize this, globalization, maybe this is a bad example for a globalization talk, but it tends to play a relatively minor role, although I'll talk about some interactions at the end. So the next important question is this a good thing? People are worried about this in every sector. I think there's this bias. It's a very important question, which is, does the increase in income, do these changes in the structure of economy promote authentic human flourishing, or in papal language, do they promote integral human development, in the words of Catholic social thought? These are super important decisions. Each person has to make ethical decisions about what to consume and what to produce, and you have to think deeply about this. Decisions about what people ought to be allowed to produce or consume are also something that societies need to reflect on. From a societal view, I think, and maybe this is my Chicago bias, but an overwhelming rule of thumb, and I don't think it's a Chicago bias, I think it's also reflects in subsidiarity, maybe it's a Catholic bias. But an overwhelming rule of thumb is that individuals generally know best. But that doesn't mean it's an absolute rule of thumb. We also can't deny the reality of human sin. Markets arise to meet human desires, and they do so very well. But in a fallen world, not every human inclination is good. So after all, there are markets for assassins, there are markets for child prostitutes, and actually child prostitutes in the countries I've worked in Thailand, in Kenya, there are horrible problems, and there's markets for mercenaries, and those are also horrible problems in developing countries. So I think in general we can be grateful that some markets are illegal, some markets are frowned upon, and some markets are thin. But these issues that I'm talking about, I think they're relevant to each of the sectors that I showed you. Farmers can grow corn or they can grow opium. Factories can make medicine or they can make machine guns. Services includes both preaching and prostitution. Production in any of these sectors could in principle treat human workers inhumanely or could treat them humanely, and the same would go with the natural environment. But I think there's nonetheless a tendency to mourn the decline of a sector from an ethical point of view. And I think that with respect to manufacturing and agriculture, there is a tendency to think that they're somehow better because the output is more tangible and it's more valuable, it's somehow more primary or more real. I think as a Catholic at least, that's like a Marxist error to think that the material is somehow more primary. At the very least, it's misguided and it's not appreciating the value of services. So manufacturing reshapes raw materials into a more useful form. Trade and finance as examples of non-useful services. There was a Dominican Irish Dominican at the turn of the century who had a funny quote, and Vincent McNabb, and he would say, people who wrest their living from toil and the earth, that's called work. People who wrest their living from those who wrest their living through toil and the earth, that's called trade. And people who wrest their living from those who wrest their living from those who wrest their living from toil and the earth is called finance. And maybe in Luigi's case that's correct, but generally, that might be true of all us professors. But this view of finance and trade as parasites on the economy, again, this is a kind of a Marxist view, and I think it's false. Manufacturing reshapes raw materials into a more useful form. Trade and finance allow these materials to be allocated to the locations and firms or peoples that will find them of most use. And in any case, when you think of manufacturing goods, and a lot of times, it's the manufacturing good that's less primary. It's a tool that better enables the provision of services. So the services is sort of more close to human flourishing than the manufacturing good. And this is clear of many important services, education, health, et cetera. The ones that I was showing you are dominating growth. Since this was supposed to be about developing countries, let me talk about agriculture. Is the movement out of agriculture, is that a good thing for countries as their income rises? Well, the first thing is, as their income rises, I think that for these poorest of countries, it's much clearer that that's a good thing. I mean, the growth of China, we worry about globalization in China, but the growth of China has moved more people out of extreme poverty than any phenomenon in the history of the world. And that's really something that we should celebrate, not fear. A second benefit is that agriculture is a large sector in poor economies. It's 50% of output, but even more when you think of workers. And a puzzle is that, on average, productivity and wages in poor countries, productivity and wages in agriculture are much lower than they are in industry, in manufacturing. So an earlier version of the Cardinal's talk mentioned, why do textile workers in Bangladesh make so little money? And for economists, when you realize that textile workers in Bangladesh, or textile workers on average, workers in manufacturing make twice what workers in agriculture do, the question isn't why these wages are so low, but why don't we have more of these jobs? So we look for bad policies and other problems that prevent the expansion of employment in manufacturing in developing countries. And some of the things, and I say this with complete goodwill and intent, but some of the policies Cardinal Turkson talked about, the policies, for example, in Italy that protect family industries. These were tried in India. There's a lot of protection, limiting the size of manufacturing firms. So what does that do? That prevents good manufacturing firms from expanding and hiring workers. Now, India in the past 15, 20 years has scaled these things back. India has actually also grown very well. It's been not as dramatic as China, but it's doing quite well. So that's another benefit. But money isn't everything, and the decline of money sometimes buys happiness, I guess, but not. I don't think it probably buys happiness as much as family or other things. And this decline of agriculture in developing countries. Bob talked about how these miracles are dramatic. So as countries develop, agriculture declines, and that leads to just huge changes. The society that, for thousands of years, human history was based on an agrarian society. And this basically comes to an end at $38,000 per capita. When you look back on, if we want to think about the issues that developing countries are going to face, we can look back on the experience that the West had, okay? This decline of agriculture involves mass movement of peoples and urbanization. Cities have a lot to offer, but they also bring with them all the problems of urban concentration, including pollution, traffic, inadequate housing, when they grow very quickly. And another thing that connects well with Catholic social thought is that if we could measure, if we as economists could measure the stock of solidarity capital, I think we'd measure a great decline as people leave close-knit communities and they move to anonymous cities. You know, family life itself experiences dramatic changes. The size of families shrink. Women work further away from their children. So these are all huge changes in society. And if we look back at Western society, how did Western societies dealt with this? You know, there was one way of responding, and it was in following the idea of subsidiarity, responding to one aspect, was that an array of social institutions emerged as a substitute for the lost sense of community or solidarity. And it was mainly done through civil society, the forming and the growth of smaller social groups. Some of these undermined the faith, such as Marxist unions and Freemasons, while some were complementary. But the church itself also played a big role, particularly in the United States, where urban parishes became communities within a community. So you have all this mass exodus of people leaving these tight-knit rural communities, and where do they find a home? They find a home in urban parishes. And urban parishes played the same role for international immigrants. But that's not all. In the 19th century, Catholics started the Knights of Columbus, and that offered insurance to the families of factory workers. That was basically what it was. It was, an insurance company. To the families of factory workers in the event of their death. And that, for development economists, that's a role that communities, local communities, had always played in rural life, which is that somebody died, everybody would help out. Protestant, it's not just Catholics. Protestants had contributions too. They started the YMCA and the YWCA, which we think of as workout facilities, but when they were started, it stands for Young Men's Christians Association. And they were to make sure that young workers migrating to cities would have a safe and wholesome place to stay and not be seduced by, urban temptations, prostitution, all sorts of things. Okay. Today's developing countries, especially for the ones that successfully develop, they are dealing and will deal with this at light speed. It took England 60 years for agriculture to fall from 25 to 10%. Thailand experienced this basically in the 1980s, so in 1 decade. The task facing these developing countries is immense. So if there's ever a time to support the church in the developing world, it's now and it's in the near future. In addition to the church and civil society, governments also responded. Measures were enacted to support rural areas, those who were left on the farms. John the 23rd grew up, his family was agrarian. He wrote about these types of things in the encyclical Mater et Magistra. This, on the positive side, schools and colleges and roads were built in rural areas to try to ensure that rural people, the people that were left behind, had equal opportunities. Agricultural extensions were developed to increase farm productivity in the hopes of boosting their income. And these were, I think, some positive things that government did. But Western governments also instituted protectionist measures. And I think this was a bad decision. First of all, it happened relatively late. These policies, what do they include? They included agricultural price supports, tariffs and quotas on agricultural imports, government purchase programs, heavily subsidized crop insurance, etc. You can see that, in the long run, agriculture still disappears as a share of the economy. We have very few farmers. While ostensibly benefiting the family farm, these policies largely serve the interest of large-scale agribusiness, which has heavy lobbying power. Much of this has been rolled back, but many of these policies continue today. I want to say one last thought. I'm on the emailing list of it's an organization called Confronting Global Poverty. That's a joint project of the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Relief Services, for whom I've consulted. I haven't consulted for this organization. I'm in Catholic Relief Services. Anyway, right now, the Farm Bill, this week, the Farm Bill is being discussed. For all I know, it might even be voted on today. It contains food aid for developing countries, and that's something that the bishops support. But it also contains agricultural subsidies. And so it leaves me, and I think it leaves the organization, in a bit of a quandary. In a global economy, subsidies that we think might protect agricultural workers in the U.S., but don't, in fact. What do? They lower the price of agriculture in the rest of the world. So they lower food prices. What is that? That's good news for the developing countries if you live in Bangkok or Mexico City and you're mainly just buying food. Low prices are good for for the urban poor. But for the rural poor, who are often the worst off, they can devastate the income of farmers in the poorest regions of Thailand and Mexico. And this can exacerbate the social upheaval, right? You've made it better for the urban workers, worse for the agricultural workers. Here's some even more economics and unexpected consequences from a very early working paper that I just read at NYU. So NAFTA gave a lot of benefits, did a lot of good things for Mexico. But when one country like the United States is subsidizing agriculture, then we get a situation where free trade, isn't exactly free. It's a misnomer to call free trade between the United States and Mexico and agriculture free trade. So the combination of NAFTA and US subsidies drove down the price of corn in Mexico. When NAFTA's signed, it goes down 20%, and it goes down even more over time. And what does this paper highlight? It highlights three effects. One is an out-migration in corn regions, areas that are well equipped for corn. Second, and I mentioned, farmers have a choice. Well, farmers switch from growing corn to growing marijuana and to growing opium. And Mexico is the largest supplier of the United States of both marijuana and heroin, which is made from refining poppy. And the third is that it related corn-rich areas after NAFTA are the places that showed they moved to opium, and they showed that this is where the murders escalated in the drug war in Mexico. So I bring this up not because it's the most important, but I think I just wanted to highlight that a lot of times the economic responses to policies are complicated. I don't think probably any of us might have anticipated all of that, but it's, again, just bringing my original statement back, it highlights the need for a vocation, not just to think about charity and justice, which are absolutely important, but charity and truth, like Pope Benedict said. And so a vocation to research is an important vocation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our respondents sincerely for the insight. Naturally, as was generously pointed out, this is a religious leader trying to say something about economics. And we don't have a Vatican School of Economics, but we do have a Chicago School of Economics. But what we do have is ultimately, at the end of the day, we're still talking about the human person. And everything that we can do to guarantee the dignity of the human person, that's what, that's what interests us. And if we talk about values or we talk about any ethical considerations, it's just because we think that the human person may not be subjected or reduced to a commodity in the light of, in face of any of these. So that's just where we're coming from. But we're glad also for the, for the insights that we've received. And we look forward to, working, if probably still inviting ideas and thoughts from the Chicago School and through the Lumen Christi office to very many people who can still be of help to us. But at the end of the day, our thing is, what can we jointly all do to safeguard the dignity of the human person in the face of all of these forces in society, be they global, economic, financial. At the end of the day, is the human person. Thanks.